I think this is one of those situations where shocking but not surprising really fits what we are watching play out.
Yeah, if anyone is surprised, they haven't been paying attention, not just for the last several years, in the interregnum between when Trump was last in office and when he is now, but the campaign in 2015 and 2016, where he was very skeptical of Ukraine, where he was talking about Russia's annexation of Crimea as something that some Ukrainians actually liked, which was just not true. He was always very skeptical of NATO and the alliance. That should not be a surprise. And he has been talking about, he has a very mercantilistic approach where he has been talking about foreign countries ripping off the U.S. for a long time. And he admires strongmen, and he admires Vladimir Putin, and has for a long time. I think this is different than just a policy switch. A policy switch would be the U.S. is not really going to fund Ukraine the way it has, or we're going to see security guarantees on the aid. This is different than what Trump himself said on Sunday to reporters, which was that he had asked Putin, does he want all of Ukraine? Something to the effect of, does he want all of Ukraine? And that would have caused a lot of problems for us. And he said no. In the last day, Trump is saying that Zelensky better move fast, which sounds like better move fast to accept the deal Trump wants, or he's going to get run over. That's more than a policy switch.
And what's changed in the last day is Zelensky coming out, and he's saying that Trump is surrounded by disinformation and not hearing the truth.
Yeah, and Trump is not fond of Zelensky. I know he keeps saying he is, but according to a number of people in his world, he isn't and hasn't been for a long time. There's all kinds of historic reasons why. Trump has a vision of Russia from its days as a superpower, and I think that he is looking at it as a more significant country. But this is not something that should surprise anyone. What is striking is just it's not silence from Congress and from Republican senators who had been pretty hawkish on Russia before and who had supported Ukraine, at least to some extent. It's, again, we're back to this gaze aversion from Republicans criticizing Trump. And instead, it's just, no, I don't agree with that word, or I wouldn't say that. And so, Trump knows that he can essentially do what he wants right now.
Well, one senator today said that she needed to see the context of the comment. I don't know what the context is to calling him a dictator.
I don't think there was a setting in which calling Zelensky a dictator was going to make more logical sense.
The question also is how this fits in with Trump's national security team in terms of Mike Waltz, who is the national security advisor, was certainly someone who is supportive of Ukraine when this war broke out. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I mean, they are two of the people who are leading these negotiations. What this looks like going forward in terms of how it changes, the position at the bargaining table is already pretty weak for Ukraine right now.
Correct. And as we know from term one, it's very difficult for people who speak for Trump. They often then see him say something contradictory to what they said publicly. I think that Rubio and Waltz in particular, and Steve Witkoff, have been pretty careful to just say what they think Trump wants and to channel him. But at the end of the day, Trump is showing again, he is the person with the last word.
You wrote an entire book on just Trump's upbringing and making of him as a young man and then a young businessman, and what that looks like and how it manifests itself in his presidency and his politics. I mean, how much of this is just getting to having a deal and getting a deal done on his watch, I guess?
I mean, that is a lot of it, but he does have some leverage points over Putin, and he has, in fact, you asked him that question, I believe. You asked Caroline Levin that question last week in the briefing room. He has given away certain pieces of that leverage with these comments. So, yes, I do think he wants a deal. Yes, I think that he wants it to go quick. Yes, I think that he truly believes that the U.S. should be repaid for some of its aid, and that's what this, resources deal that he's pushing with Ukraine is about. And I think you might see him try that with other nations. But what you give up in the process is the question and the message it sends. And this is, look, the approach he's taking, to your point about his history and his background and how he sees things, is actually how he treats everything, essentially. I mean, you could close your eyes and he could be talking about, how he wants certain senators to support his nominees, or tariffs, or judges who he doesn't like. But it's very different when it's domestic politics versus what we're talking about between Russia and Ukraine. However, that does not make the American people care more about it. And this has just not been a top of mind issue so far.
And I wonder what that looks like in terms of what is the guiding factor for him here. We know what his instincts are, and he has made clear what he wants to do. I mean, ever since we did the town hall with him, he said he just wanted to stop the killing in this. And he wouldn't say who he wanted to win, Ukraine or Russia, which when I talked to Zelensky, he didn't think that was a good sign. But in terms of, is there anyone in the administration who is saying, well, actually, here's the guardrail of that, or here's the concern if this is the path we go down?
I think there are people who raise certain concerns about some of what he is saying, but he is very much heeding his own counsel on a lot of matters these days. He often, there's a lot of discussion about strategy around Donald Trump, and he absolutely has what David Axelrod often calls some kind of a feral impulse for certain things, including weakness in other people. There's often not sort of a long-term thought on the through line of what comes next. If I do X, then Y will happen. And right now, this just seems to be about flexing muscle.
Yeah, and it was remarkable to see Mike Pence today pushing back on this, saying he disagreed.
Yes, and he was, I think, the most vocal, sharpest voice about it, and a pretty lonely voice once again. And so you will see that. I think you will see certain people who are going to push back on him. But at the moment, it looks like it is going to remain the way it did toward the end of 2020 when he was president, or for parts of 2020, and there were these sole voices. He has driven all of his critics, for the most part, out of the party.
Yeah, which is the point for him. Maggie Haberman, great reporting as always. Thank you for that.